And let's see if we can't finish this, the 10th chapter of The Revenge of the Wizard's Ghost by John Bellairs. We are at a point where the professor has come up with a theory about Ensign French, basically that he never existed and that they're reading the clues wrong. We'll go back to the beginning of the chapter or the beginning of the paragraph where we cut off last time. I can only think of one reason. The professor wrinkled his nose. I can only think of one reason, my friend. Old Zeb wanted to make it harder for us to find the Urim and the Thummim. Think of it this way. If there isn't any Ensign French, then we have a word puzzle. The key to the puzzle is the name Ensign French. Or in one of those phrases that are painted on windows or carved on walls at the estate. Ensign French is the boss. Ensign French is the unfortunate traveler. Do you follow me? Fergie jumped out of bed. He paced up and down, bit his lip, and thought hard. Suddenly, he whirled and pointed a finger at the professor. I follow you, sure, he said excitedly. But what if you're wrong? What if Ensign French is buried someplace else on that estate? Upstairs in the church, or out on the back lawn, or maybe they cremated him and the ashes are in a vase on the mantelpiece in that big old house. Couldn't that be true? The professor sighed and nodded glumly. It could indeed be true, he said. You have found a big fat hole in my clever explanation. We may just have to go over the whole estate with a fine-toothed comb till we find where they buried dear sweet Ensign French. Arg! The thought of doing all that exploring makes my bones ache. With a sudden motion, the professor ground out his cigarette in an ashtray on the table. He sprang to his feet. Byron, I am sick and tired of chewing over this Ensign French business, he announced as he brushed some lint off his coat sleeve. Let's go for a walk on this lovely Sunday morning. Get some clothes on and I'll meet you by the statue of the fireman in the middle of the town square in about 10 minutes, all right? Without waiting for an answer, he dashed across the room and out the door, slamming it behind him. A few minutes later, Fergie arrived at the town square. He was wearing a plaid shirt and corduroy trousers, and his hair was neatly combed. On a bench at the base of the statue sat the professor. He was reading a newspaper and humming quietly to himself. Pigeons were strutting on the grass, and groups of well-dressed people strolled by on their way to Sunday morning services. Ah, my friend, you have arrived at last, sighed the professor, putting down his paper. Byron, you look resplendent, and you will be fascinated to know that there is a Catholic church over on the far side of the square. I asked the desk clerk, who seems to know everything. Will you go along with me? I know your folks are Baptists, but... Fergie shrugged. I'll go. As far as I'm concerned, one church is as dull as the next one, but don't tell my mom I said that, or she'd take my head off. The professor got up and led Fergie across the sunny square. Beside a row of chestnut trees stood a red brick church built in the Gothic style. The sign outside said St. Margaret's Catholic Church, and there was a list of Mass times. They were just in time for the 10 o'clock service, so they went into the dark, cool church. The professor paused inside the door to dip his fingers in the holy water font and make the sign of the cross. We seem to be spending a lot of our time in churches these days, he whispered. Perhaps it will make us more holy. Fergie snickered, and a middle-aged lady who was passing turned and glared at him. Apparently she didn't approve of laughing in church. Taking Fergie by the arm, the professor led him into a pew near the back of the church, and the two of them sat down to wait for the service to begin. Minutes ticked past. Fergie took off his watch, wound it, and put it back on. The professor fiddled with his Phi Beta Kappa key and looked around. On their left was a neat row of tall stained-glass windows. But, as far as the professor was concerned, they were not terribly interesting. The glass was dull green and yellow and smeary brown, for the most part, and at the bottom of each window was a square plaque that told who had donated it. The professor let his eyes wander. Down the aisle a bit was a window with a shield in the middle of it. The shield was like the one the professor had noticed in the heraldry book. It had silver lilies on a blue background, but instead of just 3 lilies, this shield was covered all over with lots of lilies. The whole design was like a wallpaper pattern. Suddenly, something clicked inside the professor's mind. This was the ancient French shield he had been trying to remember the name of. All right, now, what was the name? It was... Holy H smoke! Roared the professor, and he stood straight up in the pew. He had done it. He had figured it out. And that is the end of Chapter 10.